Very good, thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction, Mark, and thank you for having me here this evening. I'm delighted to be here, obviously. It's a tremendous evening, fantastic food and great company, so thank you for that. So I wanted to, I was asked to come along here, and originally I actually had a conversation with Anne about, what I should talk about, and Anne, being the scholar that she is, quoted the Duke of Wellington, and he was asked by a vicar as to, what his sermon should be about, and he said, well, about 10 minutes, if you could, would be fine. So she didn't say that, actually. She was kind enough to give me a bit longer than that, but I was going to just talk to you about a few bits and pieces, and actually, I wanted to start by just taking you back 30 years, because actually it's quite significant for me to go back 30 years to the year 1984. Now, 1984 is a special year, of course, and of course it had that significance for all of us as we read 1984 when we were younger and assumed it was all going to be, like it was, and maybe some of it is. But the reality was, of course, George Orwell wrote that notable book, which he wrote apparently in 1948, of course, which is why he called it 1984. So if he'd written a year later, it would have been 1994. So it didn't quite turn out as he thought, but it was a very memorable year for lots of reasons. At the time, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were in power. It was an interesting era. Apple shipped the first Apple Mac in 1984. It was the year that Marvin Gaye was shot. It was the year that Tommy Cooper died. 1984. The Cirque du Soleil, which of course many of us see everywhere around the world, if you've ever been to Vegas or anywhere, you see it everywhere, was founded in 1984. But most significantly of all, it was a very special year for me because it was the year my first daughter was born. So Jenny, my eldest daughter, was born in 1984, and coincidentally, so was Cisco. So Cisco was born in 1984, a company born in Silicon Valley, born the foundation of two people who worked at Stanford University, Sandy Lerner and Len Bozak, and they were a married couple who kind of wanted to communicate across the university, worked out a way of doing that, which turned out to be the technology that Cisco founded, and then so decided they were going to set up a company which originally they wanted to call Stanford University Networking, or SUN, but Sun Microsystems had been registered a few months earlier, so they just took the tail end of San Francisco, where they both came from, and created Cisco. And Cisco was, get the bridge logo, that was the logo for Cisco was the San Francisco Bridge. That was how it all started. So an interesting time. So 30 years gone by, it was a really interesting evolution. And I'm just going to take you through a little bit of a journey, because if we're talking about innovation now and the changes and the excitement that's caused, it's sometimes really interesting just to frame how much change has actually happened and just how much we see that change influence us now, and looking at how we can adopt and capitalize on that change. Because of course Jenny was born, and she was born what's now described as a digital native. So the digital era that's now sweeping through everything was starting to change the world. But back in 1984, it was only just starting. And in fact, 2 years later, so Jenny was 2 years old now, in 1986, so-called NSFNet. And NSF was the National Science Foundation in America, created essentially the first internet backbone. As recently as 1986, it was staggering, and this is not meant to get technical, but 56 kilobits across the US. You now think nowadays you're getting gigabits or megabits at least to your home. This was the business at the time, 56 kilobit network across the whole of the US. And a remarkable change that started to happen, because it was all built on this principle, as Mark mentioned earlier, of connecting people and of sharing information. By 1986, Cisco actually announced its first product, so we're starting to move on. Jenny's now 4 years old, and we're starting to see a little bit of change happening. In 1989, Jenny, 5 years old now, she's off to school. And a rather interesting other thing happened at that time was that Tim Berners-Lee, who was working at CERN at the time, invented the World Wide Web. Not quite realizing the significance of what he'd done at the time, because of course in 1989, it didn't really go quite to the degree it did just a few years later. But actually, interesting enough, just to counterpoint it, Jenny's school was a very traditional little village school, not really much technology at all. So even though she was really generally being a digital native, not an awful lot happening at that time. The pace continued on. Cisco in 91 went public, so 1991, and also came to the UK at that point. UK was the first place outside, as many American companies do, come over to our shores, and they started to found a company and went public at that point. And in fact, as it started in the UK, we had a CEO at that time whose name was John Morgridge, not the current CEO. He eventually became the chairman. He was traditionally extremely tight. I mean, that's really his reputation, incredibly frugal. And it's true, he was. I knew John quite well. And actually, we have a funny financial year in Cisco. It finishes the end of July. And the story goes that John actually founded the company at the end of July because he reckoned that that was the time of the year when accountants were least busy, and therefore he could get the best rates for any kind of annual audits and so on. And I'm sure it's absolutely true. So anyway, so 1991, Cisco going public and starting to go there. 1993, which seems, in my eyes, quite recently, 1993, 1994, the first time we ever get the mention of the digital superhighway. Al Gore, if you remember, mentioned the digital superhighway, started to talk about things, but then was the change really started to happen. We saw companies like Netscape appearing, and Netscape, if any of those who remember it back then, was founded out of a thing called Mosaic, created Netscape, but Netscape essentially went bust. So they had the first browser ever, the thing that we all use now to access the internet, but guess what? They tried to charge for it. And the model just didn't work. And Netscape went bust. Well, they were eventually bought by AOL a few years ago. But, and very interesting to see that even at that time, business models were starting to be turned on their head. And, we saw Cisco UK being founded at that point in 93, 94, which is when I joined. So I joined Cisco 20 years ago. And when I joined in the UK, there was 10 people in the UK. It was a tiny I'd come from IBM, 20,000 people in IBM at the time in the UK. I joined a 10-person company in the UK in a tiny little office in High Wycombe. Now 6,500 people in the UK and all over the place, obviously. It's been an interesting journey. So, lots of interesting things happened in that time. And I think, if I was looking at a few lessons, the first one I'd say is, you need to buckle in this world. It's going fast, and I think it's continuing to move fast. And the things you're doing here in Northern Ireland and the aspiration we have to grow, I think is continually there. And I think you have to recognize that, this is changing fast. So, buckle in would be my first lesson, because actually it's going to continue to change. Because by the time we get to the latter parts in 93, 94, Jenny's 9 or 10 now, so she's kind of at the latter stages of her primary school. We're getting things like Toy Story. Toy Story, the movie, which fundamentally changed the whole animation world, starting to happen. Steve Jobs, of course, left Apple, went to form Pixar, or to take over Pixar, and we got a whole new world starting to happen in there, and the whole movie industry being changed. Cisco UK were getting stronger at the time, went to 1995, Jenny goes off to secondary school at that point, and then we're starting to see big data. That was when Tesco launched their loyalty card. So, as recently as that, and that whole world, interesting enough, David Sainsbury, who some of you I'm sure know, who was the recent science minister, or in the last Labour government was science minister, he decided it didn't, weren't going to have loyalty cards because it would never catch on, that technology. That was in Sainsbury. He was the chairman and CEO of Sainsbury at the time. Of course, 2 years later, they decided that wasn't the best decision he'd ever made in the world, and caught up with Tesco Club Card, because, of course, at that time, they were starting to take data and really do amazing things with it. And whole other business models were starting to appear. Tesco Club Card were uniquely mailing 12 million people with a unique mailer based on data. This is back in 1994, 95 sort of time. So really interesting time to be around. 1997, we move on to Jenny's 13, and obviously at that time there's less said the better, really, about a teenage daughter. But she was actually, carrying on in her secondary school. But internet banking started back in those days. There was a little bit of it early on. IBM Deep Blue beat Gary Kasparov for the first time. So the big computing power, when we always thought would a chess computer ever beat anybody. Dolly the sheep was cloned, which again was the start of a whole revolution in genetic mapping and genetic mapping of the genome and so on. Huge computing power required, a very, very different world starting to appear. 1998, I think, is really striking. Jenny's 14. Google was invented. 1998. I mean, it seemed like now, Google are just shaping everything we do. But 1998, as recent as that, a time when we all feel as, well, I do feel was yesterday, Google hadn't been invented at that point. The first Google page went up, from the two founders. Absolutely incredible. It was when Amazon came to the UK at that point, and the whole internet took another leap, and business models started to change again. Companies like Yahoo, who were the absolute top dogs at the time, completely, essentially, slipped away based on that lesson. And I think that's where we have to really look at, kind of the second lesson I say is, buckle in your first one. The second one is you have to get over yourself, because there isn't a business model today, including ours and many others that are involved in, that isn't going to be challenged in some way by this digital revolution. So many things have changed. It's absolutely, incredible. And no one's protected, books, search engines, whatever. Nothing is sacred at this point. Because in 1999, as Jenny is a 15-year-old, was the first product ever released by BlackBerry in 1999. That wasn't a phone, that was a pager. Before they ever went into smartphones, in 1999, BlackBerry and, of course, Nokia was also king of the world. And look what's happened to both of those companies. They've risen and completely fallen to nothing within a short number of years since 1999. So really interesting. That was the time when Cisco started acquiring companies that did Wi-Fi and so on, and there's some great stories. I remember taking my brother a Wi-Fi. I happened to have a Wi-Fi box. I took it up to his house. He had broadband at home. I plugged it in and said, "Oh, you can use your laptop, wirelessly now." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you can just go on the internet." I said, "Oh, I'll never use that. I don't need that. It's rubbish." So, and of course, and then the next minute, 3 weeks later, I get this phone call from he's down in the Institute of Directors in London. He said, "This is incredible. I've just come in and I can get on the internet. It's amazing." And I think those sorts of changes, and in fact, the story I often tell my team about that was that my youngest son, Gregory, when he was probably around this sort of time, or maybe a couple of years after this, we'd had Wi-Fi at home for a while. We were traveling up to Scotland, and Gregory had an Apple Mac in the back of the car. And he was watching a DVD on it. He watched the DVD for a couple of hours. The DVD had finished. And he said, "Dad, the internet's not working." I said, "What do you mean the internet's not working?" He said, "Well, it's not working." I said, "Well, of course it's not working. You're in the car." And he actually genuinely said, "What do you mean?" Because he just assumed that the internet was this thing that flows around in the world all the time. And in fact, if you ever read any of the Douglas Adams wrote some really good essays which were about the kind of 3 ages of man, and he talks about anything, I can't quite remember the ages exactly, I think it's 0 to 15 is anything that was invented then is infrastructure, always existed, for all of us, including Gregory, who thought the internet just always existed, and so did Wi-Fi. And then anything between the age of 15 and 35 is cool technology. You have to have one. I should have an iPad and an iPhone and so on. Not quite sure why, but I should definitely have one. And then anything that's invented after the age of 35 is like, I've no idea what you're talking about. I don't even know why you'd ever want to do that. Why would I tweet my status at any one time? So interesting observations when you get those. So this is down in that kind of time frame when we're starting to 1999, just a few short years ago. Of course, 2000 was when the dot-com bubble exploded, a few bumps in the road then. It was an interesting time for Cisco, because Cisco was temporarily the most valuable company in the world. $556 billion we were worth at that point. We're still worth, close to 200 billion, but at that time it was somewhat inflated as the dot-com thing happened. But 2002, Jenny went to university and actually had no internet in her home for the whole time she was in the flat she was in. One, because they couldn't afford it, and second, because they had to buy a landline. They didn't want a landline. They just wanted to get on the internet. So she went through at that time, even in that time, was still using floppy disks to hand in her work and so on. So really kind of interesting observation in there. But by 2002 she started. By 2004 her younger sister was at university, and that was when Facebook came. So Aileen was at Durham University, and Durham was one of the first universities outside Harvard that got Facebook. And within a year, every university in Britain had completely taken MySpace, which at the time was the business. I mean, there was 600 million people on MySpace at the time, completely trashed it. So another business model example where you've got innovation, you've got people doing things, and suddenly another model comes along and just completely challenges everything you were doing. And of course, it was based on usability and communities that you were involved in and so on. Very interesting. And we actually then started to see people in a big way using technology which they actually preferred to work technology. Because when we used to start working, many of us, I'm sure, when we started work or when you go in and they give you a nice, a nice phone, maybe a Motorola or something or another, and you got a laptop, and you think, this is quite cool, it's nicer. Nowadays, of course, when you go to work and young people come in, they think, you don't want me to use that, do you? That's that ancient thing. I've got a much better device that I use at home. And so we started to see this principle of what's called in the technology trade, bring your own device or bring your own application, because Facebook was a better way of communicating for young people than some of the things they were using already. So I think the lesson I would say in that case is it's become a user's world. Users drive this kind of thing. And the other way of expressing that was, I wouldn't be seen out in the street with that if you gave me it. And that's genuinely what happens a lot with technology. So that moved on. 2005, television started to change very significantly. We acquired a company called Scientific Atlanta. We all started using Netflix and all the other online capabilities. By 2006, 2007, Jenny starts work, joins a company, an accounting company. She's an accountant, joined an accounting company. They gave her a laptop and told her she couldn't use wireless. She's like a young person saying, why is this? I don't understand why you would do that. Why would you give me a mobile device and not allow me to use it in any mobile way? So really interesting sort of challenges started to happen. And I think we've seen that change continue. That was in 2006 range. In 2006, we actually created a technology, a video technology called telepresence, which allows you to sit in a room and chat to people as if they were in the same room. In the first year that we actually deployed that inside the company, which was 2 or 3 years later in the financial crisis, we actually took $500 million out of our airfares in 1 year. Now, that probably said we're spending rather too much money on airfares, to be fair, but $500 million of saving in 1 year, which was absolutely amazing. And then, of course, in 2007, probably the most significant announcement of the last 20 years is the iPhone was launched. If you talk to most of the big retailers in Britain now, they'll tell you that the experience that people will have of retail over the next 10, 15 years is based on the iPhone. What do people see? How do they actually experience that kind of capability? And that was only in 2007. Right? We never had the iPhone before then. Incredible, incredible change. 2009, Jenny was married. And in 2009, I could tell you that the day she was married, by the end of the day, there was over 2,000 photographs on the web. Again, you think of weddings in the past, it would be wait a few weeks till the photographs arrive. Apologies to the photographers. But basically, that was the way it was. And now, 2010, you're getting people queuing outside Covent Garden's Apple store for 2 days before the next iPhone's announced. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. So industries are just being completely revolutionized by this kind of mobile internet world. In 2011, actually, the UN actually declared the internet as a basic human right. And of course, we saw the whole Arab Spring happen, in that sort of time frame. In 2012, we provided the infrastructure for the London Olympics, which was, interesting enough, the size of the network for the Olympics was 30 times the size of the network in Beijing. So with Beijing, which had only been 4 years later, it was 30 times the size. And of course, we get to 2014 now, and everything has been disrupted. Amazon, has disrupted the bookstores. We've got Uber disrupting the taxi business. We've got Spotify disrupting the music business. We've got Google and Facebook who've changed printing and advertising. We've got Tesla who's disrupting the car business. I'll tell you another time I'll tell you my Elon Musk story, which was great. And then people like Airbnb. Airbnb, if you haven't used it before, now let more rooms than Hilton and Hyatt put together. Right? In just a short number of years. So really the fourth lesson I'd say is that atoms and bits are increasingly merging. The physical things and the non-physical things are merging, and we see big changes. So, and we're only just at the start, because less than 1% of what could be connected to the internet is connected. And in the whole world of Internet of Things, we will see a huge change happen over the next number of years. So I think we really need to recognize that, such huge changes are happening. Jenny's now 30 years old. Cisco's 30 years old. The internet, I guess, is a little over 30, but really started to be connected there. We're in a very, very different world. And I think, just to build on what we have, because in my other role, I'm not running Cisco, I also chair the government's investment agency for business, which was called the Technology Strategy Board up till recently. It's now called Innovate UK. And I think that's all about us helping you and others to take risks. Because, you know, the famous Kennedy quote which said, only those who dare to fail greatly can ever achieve greatly. Or you miss 100% of the shots you don't go for, I think, as Mark said earlier. You know, so it's really important that we give people the opportunity to build on their strengths, and many of the strengths you have here, to capture new markets and invest in new areas. Because Innovate UK's mission is actually to drive economic growth by funding, by supporting, and by connecting innovative businesses through a unique mix of people and programs. So that's the job it has, and that's what the support is to do, is to try and create that capability with a backdrop, as I've just talked about, for the last 30 years. And that's funding things that potentially wouldn't be funded otherwise, that might take long-term investment. And the interesting thing is some real tangible figures now started to appear from a recent report from Mark Walpole, the Chief Scientific Advisor, which says that, you know, if you receive a grant for innovation, stimulates about a 30% increase in a firm's own spending on innovation. And over and above the grant value, you know, it leads to increase other options. So grant recipients are typically 40% more likely to be product innovators, over 30% more likely to be process innovators, and 40% more likely to introduce novel products to the market. So we know that that investment is starting to really have an effect. And of course, over here, you guys have actually been very good at what you've done. There's a program called KTP, which is about joining universities to business. And I think when I tend to judge that every year and I give out the awards, and it's Queen's University, Belfast, typically, who is, well, not sweep the board, but they're right at the top every time. And Sue Taylor, who's is the kind of coordinator of that, does an absolutely brilliant job. And she was actually named this year as the KTP ambassador overall, so fantastic recognition to her. But also Innovate UK are investing in these centres called catapults, which will invest in a whole series of areas, from stem cell therapy to offshore renewable energy to smart cities and so on. And that programme is going to continue over the next couple of years, which gives an opportunity for small businesses to work with big businesses and university to do amazing things. So I think in this world that's ever changing, I think we've really got some interesting opportunities. There really are exciting things to be done. Every industry is changing. You know, we need the right mechanisms and the right support. And we now need what I would describe, I think what somebody said about having ambition, I think we need to have ambitious ambition. We need to really say, how can we be more ambitious? How can we stretch further to make amazing things happen? So, you know, I'm genuinely excited about the opportunities for the future. I mean, going around, I hadn't been in Belfast for a while, and, you know, I came over here and looking around the city, it's looking really great, I think, at the moment. And, you know, it's not just inspiring to watch lives change and new people do new things, but it's also, you know, bringing the UK on course to be much more competitive and even more innovative than it's been before. So I think the ambitious ambitions is something we should maybe all take away and create the kind of culture and the environment where the sorts of change we've seen over the last 30 years is just taken on board, and we are the disruptors who do very different things. You know, it's about believing that by staying the course, and that's a real challenge, particularly with government investment, we'll achieve much greater things to the advantage of the whole of the UK. And I strongly believe that, you know, the work that Innovate UK does with businesses big and small, you know, is very powerful. And I think the connections it makes, combined with the ambition to build the type of future that we've, you know, talked about earlier this evening, you know, really has the potential to dramatically improve everything, and I think drive the growth and success that we all want. So, thank you very much.